So sections 171 through 173 is part one, restricting the use of solitary confinement. And so section 171 is the findings and purpose. And so I guess, again, well, let me just start. I'd like to read the findings into the record. The Congress finds the following. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has issued the Nelson Mandela Rules, the United Nations standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. The use of indefinite or prolonged solitary confinement for more than 15 days is defined as a form of torture. Rules 43 to 45 define restrictions for solitary confinement. 2, in the summer of 2019, the US had more than 55,000 incarcerated people who had been in solitary confinement for 15 days or longer, including thousands for more than 3 years. 3, a 2014 study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that self-harm is strongly linked to being in solitary confinement. Inmates punished by solitary confinement were approximately 6.9 times as likely to commit acts of self-harm. 4, a Department of Justice review of solitary confinement published in January 2016 summarized their conclusions by emphasizing, quote, as a matter of policy, we believe strongly this practice should be used rarely, applied fairly, and subjected to reasonable constraints. In conclusion, the purpose of this part is to reduce the use of solitary confinement, to recognize the redeemability of every human being, and improve America's moral standing in the world. You know, as I studied the use of solitary confinement, I would recommend the book Hell is a Very Small Place to anyone who's interested in learning more about it, which has some of the history and writings by people who have experienced solitary confinement. This has been going on for a long time. Penitentiaries comes from the word penance, and were sort of the idea was to incarcerate people and give them time to be thoughtful and to reflect. Unfortunately, didn't do what it was supposed to do. And in 1842, Charles Dickens, who was doing a book tour in the United States, had the opportunity to visit the Eastern State Penitentiary, and he got a chance to see some of these people who were serving time in solitary confinement. And he was outraged. In his writings, he concluded, quote, I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony with this dreadful punishment, prolonged for years, inflicts upon the sufferers. And in guessing at it myself, and in reasoning from what I have seen written upon their faces, and what to my certain knowledge they feel within, I am only the more convinced there is a terrible depth of which none but the sufferers themselves can fathom, and which no man has a right to inflict upon his fellow creature. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. And because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye and the sense of touch as scars upon the flesh, because its wounds are not upon the surface, and it extorts few cries that human ears can hear, therefore the more I denounce it as a secret punishment which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay. In 1890, the United States Supreme Court recognized the harm that solitary confinement caused to people's mental health in the case Henry Medley. Some prisoners they found, quote, became violently insane, others still committed suicide, while those who stood the ordeal better were not generally reformed, and in most cases did not recover sufficient mental activity to be of any subsequent service to the community. We have known for a long time that solitary confinement is torture. We know, and yet tens of thousands of people in America are subject to it for days, for weeks, for months, for years at a time. We are inflicting unnecessary suffering on people, and that is not justice. We can do better. We can do better. So with that, Mr. Next Chair, I think that concludes my testimony on section 171.
Thank you. I do have a question. Do we know, are there any findings on use of solitary confinement for fewer than 15 days?
That's a great question. I don't recall, I guess I don't recall anything specifically about that, but that the drawing the line at 15 days is what the United Nations recommends. And so, again, I would like to see this practice abolished, but I am a practical idealist. And the place to start is by meeting the United Nations standards. United Nations sets a standard of 15 days, and we in the United States are failing by far to meet that standard. And so the place to start is there. And as we continue to recognize the humanity in people, I believe that using solitary confinement will fall out of favor, and it will be used less and less. But this bill does not abolish it completely. It only restricts it in the way that I've described.
Thank you.
I guess I should go on to describe how exactly we restrict solitary confinement. Because this is an easy soundbite for candidates to make. And the candidates running 2022, a half dozen of them, yes, we support reforming solitary confinement. And despite the fact that most of them are still serving in public office, nothing is really being done. And part of it is because what exactly does that mean to reform solitary confinement? And it's easy to just make sort of a nebulous statement in support. But that's one of the reasons that our political structure is broken in the United States, because we elect candidates based on nebulous statements. And so the blueprint for a better America is a model of turning it around, defining exactly what we want to restrict solitary confinement so that we can better hold candidates for federal office accountable. So section 172 has the specifics, and I'm going to share my screen and get into some of these definitions. Before I do, though, I want to talk a little more about the history and President Obama, who restricted the use of solitary confinement against juveniles in 2016, in part in recognition of the death of Caliph Browder. He was 22 at the time, but as a teenager, had been incarcerated in Rikers Island, New York City, for years, spent years in solitary confinement for allegedly stealing a backpack. And when his family was unable to pay his bail, he languished there, never got a trial, but eventually charges were dropped and he was freed. But the mental trauma that he had been put through by his years in solitary confinement was too much, and he took his own life. This is not unusual, but it is not unusual, and it is not justice. And President Obama wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post and said, quote, "The United States is a nation of second chances, but the experience of solitary confinement too often undercuts that second chance. Those who do make it out often have trouble holding down jobs, reuniting with family, and becoming productive members of society. Imagine having served your time and then being unable to hand change over to a customer, or look your wife in the eye, or hug your children." Again, if you'd like to know more about some of the experiences of people with solitary confinement, I recommend the book Hell is a Very Small Place. And people describe how traumatizing, how the panic response that they feel of being in a crowded space. A prison cell is maybe 6 feet wide, 10 feet deep, small space, and you only ever see people from one direction. There can never be anybody like behind you or to the sides of you. And having that changes your perspective, the way you look at the world, when that is the only experience that you have. And then to suddenly be out in the world again and have people all around you, we're setting people up for failure when we treat them this way. So President Obama ordered the Justice Department to review the practice of solitary confinement and will make recommendations. And so a number of their recommendations are included in section 172. There is no good model legislation. So in compiling section 172, at various states, such as Connecticut and New York, have passed legislation related to solitary confinement, and as well as other recommendations, and try to put it together to meet as many as address as many of these concerns as possible. We also talked to incarcerated Americans and asked them, what were their experiences, what were their concerns. I got feedback from one man in a Michigan prison who said, he ought to at least be able to get a phone call once a month in solitary confinement. That was what he wanted. And so, I had to tell him that, well, this didn't actually address phone calls. It would restrict it to 15 days in solitary confinement. And I hope that would help address his concern. So I'm going to share my screen, and we can go through this bill in a little more detail on the restrictions on the use of solitary confinements. And subsection A of these new provisions, it is our definitions of the correctional facilities, of what emergency confinement is. Emergency confinement does not count as a solitary confinement as long as it doesn't go on for more than 24 hours. Inmates or anyone confined to a correctional facility. Covers psychiatric emergencies, serious mental illnesses. And our definition of solitary confinement: the term solitary confinement means the involuntary confinement of an inmate to a cell or similarly confined holding or living space for approximately 22 hours or more per day, with severely restricted activity, movement, and social interaction. Solitary confinement does not include confinement due to facility-wide or unit-wide lockdown that is required to ensure the safety of inmates and staff. Now, earlier this month, the 122 prisons under the Bureau of Prisons were locked down. That the 134,000 inmates were locked in their cells as part of a national lockdown. And so the restriction on solitary confinement in this bill would not be solitary confinement as defined by this bill. One of the other questions that came up was how many hours per day is solitary confinement? And different states have taken different standards. United Nations sets the standard at 22. And so that's the one that we've adopted here. New York State has recently passed one that I believe sets it at 17 and a half hours. I believe Connecticut is 19 and a half hours. Different states have different standards. But for simplicity's sake, and again, for being practical idealists, we went with the United Nations standards of 22 hours. Definitions who are the vulnerable people who should not be sent to solitary confinement. Again, age is young people, their minds are growing, and solitary confinement can be even more damaging on young people, like it was to Caliph Browder. All right, subsection B is the restrictions on the use of solitary confinement. And so one, it restricts the use. No vulnerable person shall be placed in solitary confinement except for medical seclusion and only for disciplinary reasons if they've met the standards of subsection C. So right now, people can be assigned to solitary confinement for all sorts of reasons. And this legislation would change that. So not for administrative reasons, not. I talked to a man in Oregon who he spent 3 months in solitary confinement. They didn't want to put him in general population because years earlier he had competed in Taekwondo tournaments or some martial arts, and so the idea was that he could be a danger to others if they put him in general population. So they left him in solitary confinement for 3 months. And this bill would set the standards so that there would have to be a specific disciplinary reason for assigning someone to solitary confinement. It B2 would cap this at 15 consecutive days or 30 days in any 60-day period. And it would require that get regular medical and mental health examinations conducted by clinicians. And then part 3 addresses some of the other concerns of people in solitary confinement and meets some of the other standards set by the United Nations, that no one in solitary confinement should be subjected to corporal punishment, can't place them in a cell or holding space that is dark or constantly lit, one that doesn't have functioning sanitary facilities, proper ventilation, or temperature monitoring, can't be denied access to appropriate medical care, including emergency medical care, denied or given reduced access to food, water, adequate clothing, or any other basic necessity. No variation in food from the standard menu shall be permitted without the inmate's consent, except for a limited period not to exceed 7 days for an inmate who has used food or food service equipment in a manner that is hazardous. And this comes up again, talking to incarcerated people. They have something called Nutriloaf, and it is essentially bland, tasteless, meets the dietary needs of people. Put beans and vegetables and powdered milk and all sorts of stuff and bake it into a loaf that you can eat with your hands, so you don't need any silverware. And some states have in fact found this to be cruel punishment. I think Vermont. And so as we're setting the standards here, you can't mix up people's diet for punishment unless it's to address something that they've done with their food. Subsection C spells out exactly what has to happen before someone can be sentenced to the prison within a prison, before they can be sentenced to solitary confinement. Correctional facilities have to establish maximum penalties. We recommend that if they're accused of something, they shouldn't be sent to solitary confinement just until they've actually had a hearing. It does allow for that to take place. Solitary confinement should be reserved for offenses involving violence, or for the threat of violence, coercion involving sexual acts involving escape, or posing a threat to institutional safety by encouraging others to engage in such misconduct. Again, there are so many examples of people who are sent to solitary confinement, minor offenses. In California, people get locked up for years, put into segregation if they're accused of being associated with a gang. And they can be there on the flimsiest of evidence, such as just having their name appear being offered by another inmate. And so we can do better by establishing very clear standards, and solitary confinement would be allowed. Disciplinary hearings, which may result in solitary confinements, set standards requiring that the inmate has the ability to appear, ensure that they have access to legal representation. Again, if you're going to sentence someone to the prison within a prison, they ought to have legal representation before that takes place. They'd have the right to have the hearing conducted by an independent hearing officer outside of the regular chain of command, have these hearings recorded, make a transcript available, and a decision is reached, provide a written statement of reasons for the decision that is made. We allow exemptions for inmates who demonstrate symptoms of mental illness, and ensure that they get the attention of the medical staff, preferably the treating clinician, and the clinician gets an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not sentencing them to solitary confinement would be inappropriate because it would interfere with sports that are part of their treatment or recovery plan. Hearing does result in an adjudication of guilt. Disciplinary solitary confinement is only if other sanctions are insufficient to serve the purposes of punishment. And vulnerable people, as described in paragraphs E or F, those were people with serious medical conditions, including being pregnant or recently pregnant. They could be held in medical seclusion, but no one under the age of 21, for example, sentenced to solitary confinement. They would be protected because they're recognized as a vulnerable person. And subsection E, more about medical seclusion, essentially solitary confinement, but under the observation of medical staff. Can be done in response to a psychiatric emergency. If attempts to de-escalate fail, and trying to recognize the dignity of people. Sometimes people who are put in solitary confinement, especially if they're suicidal, they may take all their clothes. And so to recognize the dignity, there would have to be a finding that was absolutely necessary for something like that. And we set standards for how frequently that they'd have to be observed, and ensuring that at least every 8 hours there's a clinical review of their health to see if medical seclusion is still medically necessary. And so those are the specifics. It's not enough to just say we support reforming solitary confinement. We need a very clear plan of action to address that. And so that's what Section 172 does. And with that, Mr. Chair, I think that concludes my testimony, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yes. Yeah, no, so I did have a question though. So you kind of touched on this a little bit before about just restricting it to 15 days, meeting the standard of the United Nations, but another standard of the United Nations is this 22 hours. And I worry about a potential loophole where we're putting people in for 21 hours at a time and just not calling it solitary confinement, and then you can just do that as many days in a row, but it's still effectively the same punishment. Are there any kinds of protections against those kinds of loopholes?
No, clearly it's not a frivolous concern. In my research, I found New York, I think it was New York State. They used to have a limit of 10 days. You can only have 10 days in solitary confinement. And so every 10 days, the incarcerated person would have to be moved back to general population, move all their stuff. They'd for 1 day, and then they'd send them back for another 10 days. And so it was a huge headache and hassle where, the inmates didn't appreciate having their life disrupted 2 weeks just to meet the letter of the law. And so that's one of the things that we try and address by having the 60-day cap. As far as the 21 hour cap, you've got to draw a line somewhere. And so 22 hours is the one that the United Nations recommends. And by trying to set these standards and recognize the humanity of people, hopefully states won't try and look for loopholes, and instead will recognize the spirit behind it.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Have some states adopted these types of reforms, and what were the results?
Actually, a number of states have done this and seen large reductions in things like against staff. Colorado did this years ago, and as part of they got a new director of prisons or whatever, and was looking for ways to make prisons more humane. And so they tried to dramatically reduce the amount of solitary confinement they were using, and found it was very, very effective. Again, I mean, this is the golden rule: treat people how you'd want to be treated. And but yeah, New York has recently passed legislation, New Jersey, I think, as well, and Connecticut passed a bill, governor vetoed, and then issued an executive order writing a bunch of the parts of it. I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Section 173 is just the part that incentivizes states to take up these restrictions, right, that we've done, all throughout Title I, by threatening to withhold burn grants. And so solitary confinement, again, prisons are very entrenched. And so there's a 2-year phase in for this. Phase one, which would be effective in the 2025 fiscal year, so starting in 2024, would require states to have this 15-day maximum. It would require the mental health exams and address the other humanitarian conditions. No keeping someone in a cell with no lights or constant lights or things like that. So it would require those kind of things. First phase, and then the second phase would put the restrictions, the protections in place for all vulnerable people and for disciplinary reasons only. And then I think next year that concludes my testimony for section 173.
Thank you. I do have a question here. You've used Byrne grants as leverage against the states a lot of time, many times in Title I. Is this an all or nothing deal for them? Might they agree to restrict solitary confinement and chokeholds and reform cash bail, but not restrict no-knock warrants? So would they lose everything? In which case, where's the incentive to fix any of it?
Thank you for the question. No, it's a fair point that because the way it is set up right now as an all or nothing. Make all these reforms on the state level or lose all the federal funding. And so there might be a better way to structure the incentives so that that states don't just say, well, we don't want to bother with any of it. But yeah, as it's set up right now, it is all or nothing.